Ahoy! Heartrunes are one of the big important additions that are coming next patch, and as each of them has 3 upgrades, you may be wondering which one of those will be best for you. So I will break that down with the crafting materials included, but there's more, because with the different patches throughout PTR, some of the Heartrunes have actually changed a little bit, something that they haven't mentioned anyway yet, and there are also some interactions not working as expected or intended yet, we'll have to find out, but that's also worth talking about today. Let's begin with the Heartrune of Grasping Vines. This is now a 4 meter AoE, it used to be smaller than that, and that will root all enemies within that area for 3 seconds. And this is also where we find our first inconsistency. Many Heartrunes can be affected by external effects like empowers, for example, or effects that can increase the duration of certain buffs. But for Grasping Vines specifically, what you would think would work, being the 300 Constitution perk and the Heavy Armor perk that increase crowd control duration, both don't work at all. I'd like to thank Af for testing this with me. He even sent me a screenshot right after he got CC'd, and just to make 100% sure, I measured this with my recording software as well. It's literally just a flat 3 seconds when it should be 4.2 seconds based on how other crowd control works, and there's no indication in the crowd control descriptions that it doesn't affect Heart Gem runes at all. So while I originally thought that this would heavily encourage this rune being used by heavy armor and high con users, by tanks in general, that is not the case. There's no additional benefit in that, at least as of now, unless that gets fixed. Damage wise, with 250 base damage before all the scaling is applied, this rune is on the weaker end. The base version of the rune drops from Alluvium Mal in Gardens of Genesis. The first upgrade effect that all runes get is Enfeebling Vines, which inflicts Weaken on successful hit, reducing the target's damage by 20% for 8 seconds. The first legendary upgrade option is the Cunning Heart rune, which provides you with Leeching Vines, which allows you to heal for 20% of the damage done to rooted targets. Honestly, with the base damage being relatively low, I wouldn't recommend that, and there's another Heartrune that does a similar job of self-heal and CC much better, so I don't really think there's much of a reason to use this one. The second legendary option is the Stalwart Heartrune, and this one comes with Resilient Vines. This gives you 20% damage absorption or Fortify, but also reduces your outgoing damage by 20% for 5 seconds. Crafting this, by the way, requires Writ of Adventure, which you can get from questing in Brimstone Sands or from your faction vendor. I think this one is rather niche though, because there are relatively few situations where you're okay with reducing your damage output. The main use case I could see for this is if you're using this for self-peel as a healer and you don't really care about your damage output and you just want more survivability when you're rooting the enemy. But I imagine that most light armor users that are after a defensive choice will not necessarily go for the Vines. The third option is the Brutal Heartrune. This comes with Rending Vines, which applies a 20% rend to targets hit by the Grasping Vines for 5 seconds. But it also reduces your stamina regeneration by 50% for 5 seconds. I think for the types of players that will make most use of this rune, which will likely be bruisers in heavy or medium armor, the downside here is okay. You are gonna have less stamina, but the enemies are also gonna be in a root for 3 of these 5 seconds, so it's only 2 seconds more with half stamina regeneration. But it's not like you're at much risk in that moment, because enemies around you will have Weaken and Rend on them anyways. If the rune gets fixed and you can actually apply 4.2 seconds of root, then the downside is also gonna be even smaller. One thing worth noting with the Vines is that they seem to have a very short wind up, which doesn't have CC immunity, and if you get staggered or interrupted during this wind up, it seems to put the ability on cooldown without it going off. So be a bit aware of that when using it aggressively. Now, while I would technically consider this the best rune, apparently, currently the purple Heartrune, the major Heartrune of Grasping Vines, is the only one that can go over the 3 seconds cap with additional crowd control increase effects. At least according to what XR was able to find in the files, this one should be able to reach the full 4.2 seconds. As such, for now, until they fix it so that that's the case for all Heartrunes, the purple rune may actually be the best Vines rune, at least for tanks. The next rune is Stoneform, which drops from Chardis in Lazarus. This one has the lowest base damage of all the runes, starting with 150, and the effect is harden yourself with layers of stone, cleansing all crowd control debuffs and granting immunity to both stagger and crowd control debuffs for 5 seconds. So this is generally the safety net option that we'll likely see on a lot of light armor users, healers especially. The first upgrade to that is the Fortifying Form, which gives an additional 10% fortify or damage absorption while the stone form is active. The first legendary upgrade form is the Greater Heartrune of Stoneform. This one gets Hardened Form as an additional effect, which gives you additional 10% damage absorption for 5 seconds per hit taken with a maximum of 30%. Since this is labeled as damage absorption, this will likely count towards the fortifying cap as well. That is pretty much its only downside. If you already have a massive amount of fortify, then you will probably hit cap and you won't benefit from this, but otherwise it's up to 40% fortify that you're getting here for 5 seconds, which I think is a very, very good safety net in addition to the crowd control immunity. So if you're getting engaged on, I think this is probably your best bet to survive that for most builds that aren't heavily capped on fortify. The other Stoneform Heartrunes have interesting perks, but I don't think they come close. The next one is Stalwart Heartrune of Stoneform, which comes with Mending Form, and that heals you for 75% of Heartrune damage per second while it's active, but your outgoing damage is reduced by 20%. This may in some situations actually give you more survivability, but the problem is the moment there's any anti-heal around, this will be reduced, and that is something the other Heartrune doesn't really suffer from. And I would generally say having mitigated damage in the first place is usually more beneficial than healing it back up afterwards. Especially when you're using Stoneform on a healer, you're going to be more likely to be focused by people with anti-heal, so they're just going to get double for their money there. The third option is the Brutal Heartrune of Stoneform, which comes with Unstable Form. This adds a detonation to the stone form, which either happens at the end when it expires, or if you activate the Heartrune again. This deals 200% base damage, but it's actually not that much compared to other runes that just have way higher base damage in general. Like, it doesn't come close to, for example, a Detonate rune. It's also just in a 3-meter radius and reduces the duration by 2 seconds. I think overall this is more of a gimmicky option, because if you're looking to get survivability, which you would with Stoneform, then getting like half damage out of it doesn't seem great to me personally. It can be a nice deterrent to scare off overly aggressive enemies, but I don't think it's worth losing your Stoneform for. The third Heartrune is the Heartrune of Detonate, which drops from Heru in the Ennead. This has the highest base damage of 600 and charges yourself for 3 seconds until you detonate, dealing 100% Heartrune damage in a 5-meter radius. The first upgrade provides you with Accelerating Charge, which increases your movement speed by 30% while charging. Now, something I don't know yet is how the gear score factors into the damage output for Heartrune specifically. If this ends up being a non-factor and the damage for a 625 and 560 gear score Heartrune is actually the same, then the major Heartrune of Detonate may be your best option in some scenarios. That's because it's the only one that doesn't come with any trade-offs. The first legendary upgrade, the Cunning Heartrune, comes with Empowering Charge. This increases your outgoing damage by 15% while charging, which is a 15% empower, but the explosion damage is reduced by 20%. So if you're looking for an empower, this can be beneficial, but if you're already close to empower cap from other effects, then this is not gonna give you much additional benefit. I think for most PvP scenarios, this will be the safe go-to option, because in PvP you're usually not gonna run around at empower cap. In PvE, you're closer to Empower Cap much more often, and this will probably have less value. The second option is Stalwart Heartrune, which gives you Leeching Explosion, heal for 50% of the damage done, but the explosion damage is reduced by 30%. Again, there is a better Heartrune if lifesteal is what you're after, and I don't think that reducing your damage output by 30% on the Heartrune of Detonate specifically is worth it, so I don't really see much value in this particular one. The third option here is the Brutal Heartrune of Detonate, which comes with Escalating Explosion. The explosion damage is increased by 30%, but you take 15% more damage while charging, so very much the glass cannon option. For PvE, I would say this is hands down the best option, because in PvE the risk of actually getting hit by something is much lower, and you're gonna benefit from doing all that extra damage all the time. In PvP, I would label this high risk, medium reward. You can most certainly get away with it, especially if you're running something like, for example, Hatchet, and you're just gonna run Defy Death anyways. Or maybe if you're running this also in heavy, because you're dealing less damage overall then, but you're also not going to be as fussed about taking 15% more damage for a bit. But for many others, taking 15% more damage is just incredibly dangerous. It's even more risky with the Greatsword, which already has another effect that makes you take more damage while you're in the assault stance. I think it's a very strong rune, and the 30% movement speed slightly offsets the extra damage taken because you can juke better as well. But I would definitely recommend having a cunning or just a major Heartrune at hand as well, in case there's ever a situation where you don't want to get blown up too easily. And speaking of blowing things up, there's also the Heartrune of Cannon Blast. This one you actually get from the questline that introduces you to the Heart Gems, which is Secrets of the Heart Gem, but if you want to farm it after that, you can also get it from Barnacles and Black Powder. This is the second highest rune after Detonate with 500 base damage, but it is a lot more single target focused. The purple version, the major Heartrune, gives you Burning Blast, which inflicts burn on successful hits, dealing 10% Heartrune damage per second for 5 seconds. In this case, there's no benefit in keeping a major one because the first upgrade is Cunning Heartrune, which gives you Penetrating Blast. With this one, the cannonball passes through enemies and can also not be blocked, even though even before that only ranged projectile blocks block it in the first place. This one doesn't reduce the damage or have any other negative downside, so it's really just a better version of the major Heartrune. At the same time, the effect itself is also not particularly spectacular because enemies usually don't line up and it's gonna be rare that you even hit more than 2 targets. The second option, Stalwart Heartrune, gives you Concussive Blast, which reduces the Heartrune damage down to 30% of its original value, but gives the cannonball a knockdown. I find this one extremely difficult to evaluate because we don't really know how long the knockdown is, how effective it will be, so it's gonna be hard to say anything about it really. It could be interesting and effective if it can combo well into other CC, that I will say at this point, and more I don't know. We'll have to try it. I believe that option will be rather niche anyways, because I don't think most people who pick Cannon Blast are going to pick it for the CC. The third option is the Brutal Heartrune of Cannon Blast, which gives you Explosive Blast. Cannonball explodes on impact, dealing damage within a 3-meter radius, but the damage is reduced by 20%. Now this may sound strange, but I think that this may actually be the best option even when going for single target damage. The problem that I found with the Cannon Blast is that the hitbox of the projectile itself is extremely small. It almost feels more like a bow projectile even though it's supposed to be a cannonball. I don't know if it was a PTR ping issue for me, but it felt like it was extremely difficult to hit for being something on such a long cooldown. And I know that even people that are very, very fluent, so to speak, with the bow or the musket will still miss some shots in between. And as such, I am thinking that this Heartrune is actually a good workaround. Because with this one, you no longer have to aim at the body and you no longer have nearly the same risk to miss this shot, because you can just aim at the feet of the enemy, at the ground, and the Detonate will still hit them for 80% of the damage. And as far as I understand it, this should still apply Burning Blast as well, so you'll just deal 130% instead of 150% damage in total. And obviously, in any situation where there's more than one enemy around, this becomes a massive benefit. Of course, assuming the enemies are not all lining up behind each other. I do believe that for many characters that like to be more in the fray, Cannon Blast will be a bit of a second fiddle to Detonate, but for those who make good use of it, like for example musket users, I think Explosive Blast or the Brutal Heartrune would be the way to go. Though, even for them, they have to consider if they wouldn't rather have the Stoneform. The last Heartrune is the Heartrune of Dark Ascent, which we can get from Isabella. With 300 base damage, it's right in the middle of the field, and it allows you to fly up for a brief moment and then crash down back onto the ground, dealing 100% Heartrune damage in a 3-meter radius. You can also use this early and drop down immediately. The major upgrade gives you Leeching Ascent, healing you for 100% of the damage done by the ability. And this is why I was saying the other leeching perks aren't really important. If you're really looking for leeching, then you're likely looking for the Heartrune of Dark Ascent, because it has way more leeching than any other ability and still a pretty decent amount of base damage. Different from the others, this effect doesn't come with a damage cut. The first legendary version is Cunning Heartrune, which has Crippling Ascent. Inflicts slow on successful hits, reducing the target movement speed by 30% for 4 seconds. This is actually pretty good. This is longer than the root or the vines, So as a CC tool, this is actually pretty decent, and it also heals you at the same time. It doesn't come with the additional weaken or rend though. I could imagine this being somewhat useful as a safety tool. You fly up to avoid damage, and then when you crash down, you slow enemies, and then you have the chance to quickly move away. The second upgrade option is Stalwart Heartrune, which gives you Fortifying Ascent. Gain Fortify on successful hits with up to 3 hits maximum, increasing damage absorption by 10%, but reducing outgoing damage by 10% for 5 seconds per hit. Note that this refers to hits, unlike the Stoneform, not hits taken. So it seems like this refers to the AoE damage, so you have to drop down on 3 targets to get the full Fortify, and then you also get 30% reduced damage. I don't think this trade-off is good in many situations, and I feel like you're just much better off slowing all enemies around you and getting away and avoiding damage taken that way, rather than having this odd trade-off that also relies on you having a lot of enemies around. That is assuming I'm interpreting this description correctly. The last option is the Brutal Heartrune, which gives you Empowered Ascent. Successful hits deal 150% Heartrune damage, but no longer stagger. Based on how Leeching Ascent is described, this should also increase the healing that you get along with the damage that you're dealing, because it heals for 100% of the damage done, and if the damage done is increased to 150%, that should apply here as well. So this should be the best self-sustain option. I think losing a stagger is a significant downside, and I think not getting the slow, which I think is a very nice follow-up tool, is also a significant downside, and I feel like in many situations you actually end up dealing less damage with this option, but in the situation where it's effective and you're hitting a lot of enemies, you can basically be surrounded, drop down on them, deal a lot of damage to them, and heal for an absolutely insane amount. So I think this one could actually be the most interesting of the Dark Ascent rune, which I would generally consider more of a niche rune. What's also interesting with the Dark Ascent that I have yet to test is if you can fly over the Detonate rune or not. Because if you can, then it's an incredible counter to the Detonate. You just see someone charging up, you fly into the air, theirs explodes, and you drop down on them with this increased damage, and you also heal on top of that. So overall, there are a lot of things to consider with the Heartrunes. I think especially the Detonate, the Stoneform, and the Vines will be popular initially, but we could see specific counter strategies with the other ones that should be very interesting. If you want to learn more about everything that is coming in the next update, including in-depth info on the Greatsword, I have a lot of that coming up in the next days, so please consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Thanks for watching, Duke Sloth, out.